that feels like a really good bit of advice for teaching in general. And I think having that piece of advice at the beginning of my teaching career would have been really helpful rather than trying to fix everything in one go.
I think we have a responsibility to make sure that all young people have been taught how to interact with that technology. Welcome to Hello World, a podcast by educators interested in computing and digital making. I'm Carrie-Anne Philbin, a computing content creator for the Raspberry Pi Foundation, leading the development of the Teach Computing curriculum.
And I'm James Robinson, a computing educator. I'm working on projects promoting effective pedagogy within the subject, such as our recently published Big Book of Computing Pedagogy, which is available digitally for free at helloworld.cc/big book. If you want to support our show, then subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a 5-star review.
Today, we're asking, how do we make computing education more accessible and inclusive? Earlier this season, we discussed the importance of diversity within computing and access to computing education. But you may have thought, what about inclusion? What are the strategies and resources that teachers can use to ensure their students with special educational needs and disabilities are accessing computing in a meaningful way? James, what do you understand we mean when we talk about inclusion?
Well, it's interesting you ask, Carrie-Anne. I think you're right. You've mentioned a couple of different words there in your introduction, diversity and accessibility and inclusion. And I think they all kind of stem from an overarching goal to make it so that all learners can access and participate meaningfully within challenging learning opportunities is kind of my sort of broad understanding of this entire space. When we talk about access, we're often talking about like the removal of barriers, and that's what we focused on a lot in one of our earlier episodes. Diversity is about that goal of including the broadest range of learners as possible, and making sure it is for everybody. And then for me, inclusion is making sure that all of our learners are not only engaged, but they are able to thrive and to learn within the subject, whatever their needs, specific challenges or backgrounds might be. You know your inclusion, and I know you're very passionate about it. Does that kind of align with your perspective?
Yeah, I think for me, diversity and inclusion, they quite often overlap. There's a beautiful Venn diagram, and I think there's a point in the middle where they meet. But often I think they have some perhaps different strategies around them, and some different ways that we as educators should ensure that we're implementing to reach all of our young people. So I'll tell you a story. When I was teaching, I taught a student who had autism. And he was I used to teach sets, even at kind of a younger high school age group, so ages between sort of 11 and 13. All of our young people were put in academic sets based on their maths and English outcomes and their assessments. So I had a really high level group, a group that were going places academically, really what we would call a top set. And even this language is not the most inclusive, right? But this is generally how we talk about this in education. And I had a student in there with autism, and I'll call this student Dave. That's not his name, but that's the name I'm going to use. And Dave was really interesting. He was clearly high functioning. He was a smart boy, non-verbal, as you would expect from a young person with autism. And he was in my computing class, and he was one of my best students. He would engage. I remember when we first introduced programming, we used Sonic Pi, which is a platform that was developed for programming music using Ruby. We brought this into my classroom. It was actually a test group we were testing it with. And he took to it immediately. I remember we had this crazy lesson around variables. This was the early days. We weren't really quite sure how to teach variables well. The rest of the kids didn't get it, but he got it straight away and was he understood abstraction, kind of understood what was going on. And I remember bumping into his head of year later on that day and saying, "Oh my God, Dave, amazing. He's doing great things in our subject. I definitely think we should put him forward for the prize this year." And that head of year said to me, "Oh, that's so great. It's so great that finally there's something that he can do." And I was so taken aback by that response, because my experience of that young person was amazing. He was clearly engaged. He got it. He was supporting other students. He was amazing. But clearly for this head of year, their experience of that young person was perhaps not the same in other subjects, but also had put limitations on that young person about what they could achieve. That made me really start to think about the importance of computing education. And I think with our subject, We have a responsibility because young people, whatever their background, are using technology every day. They're consuming it, they're using it. We're now getting them to a point where they're creating and building with it. I think we have a responsibility, just like with all their peers, to make sure that all young people have been taught how to interact with that technology safely. They know how to be responsible with that technology, and they can use it effectively. Whether that's just using social media as their peers might do, or whether it's using technology to help them in their everyday life, like be able to speak or help them with their typing or whatever the extra support that technology brings them, we have a duty of care to make sure that they really fully understand that technology. That's sort of my perspective on inclusion, and it's a sort of very personal story. Thankfully, we don't have to have all the answers. We've been joined by two experts to help us dig into this topic. Our first guest, Catherine Elliott, the Special Educational Needs and Disabilities Lead for the Sheffield e-learning service, co-chair of the Computing at School Include Working Group, leader of the virtual SEND CAS community.
She's also a host of several of our Raspberry Pi online courses. So, Catherine, what do we mean by inclusion? And is this different to differentiation, for example?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. Just always delighted to talk about this subject. And I think inclusion is really difficult in some ways because it means different things to different people. As Carrie-Anne said, it's a very personal thing. And it means something different perhaps in education as it does in business. And I think, James, you touched on this about having equal access and opportunities to an education, to computer science, computing, and a removal of barriers. And actually, one of the best quotes I ever came across, I like to illustrate this, is from Susan Goldsman. She was quoted in a wonderful book called Mismatch by Kat Holmes. And she was really talking about inclusive design, but I think it speaks for all of inclusion. She talked about designing a diversity of ways to participate so that everyone has a sense of belonging. And I love that because that sense of belonging is a really important thing, because you mentioned differentiation, and it's very easy to give a child a different worksheet to do or send them to a corner of the room or out of the room completely because they can't access it. And actually, good inclusion is about everybody having a seat at that table and being part of the classroom community and taking part in whatever they can as part of that. And it's really difficult to do well. I'm not saying, it's easy at all, but that sense of belonging that we should have, that our children go, yeah, I'm part of this class and this lesson, and I'm doing it on my terms, but somebody is helping me to overcome any barriers that I have and putting things into place so that I can, make the most of this opportunity. So I think that's where I come from inclusion from.
I talked about this Venn diagram of where we talk about diversity kind of meets with inclusion. And I think that idea of belonging really sits in that kind of crossover space. And I think if I was going to give any tip to any educator, it would be always start from that perspective, right? Like think about what does it mean to belong in the classroom?
Absolutely. And I think, what's really interesting about this is that research shows that actually, if you do inclusion well, those children with special needs and disabilities achieve better and they have developed better skills and confidence. But actually, the benefits don't stop there. They benefit every child in that classroom. And I think it's the best thing we can do is be inclusive, because it's really, really great for all of those things and all of those young people.
And what do you think are the barriers that educators face in terms of making their classroom more inclusive, to adopting this kind of approach? What challenges do we face as educators?
I think it's probably one of the same barriers that we have for everything, and the biggest one is time. As educators, as teachers particularly, we don't have time. So we don't have time to find out what the strategies are that work. We don't have time to get to know every single one of our children well enough to possibly put things into place. That's something we should be doing. But if you're a teacher in high school and secondary and you're teaching 200-300 pupils in a week, then, it's very hard to get to know them all and their individual needs and the barriers they're facing. And I think if the culture of a school doesn't support inclusion, then as an individual teacher, it's really hard to kind of put things into place that are meaningful. It's very similar to the barriers of teaching a good computing curriculum. I don't have the time to find out what works. I don't have the confidence in it. So perhaps, I'm not entirely sure, so I won't do this.
Yeah, and I think you're kind of touching there, and Carrie Ann kind of mentioned in her example, her story. There are structural challenges in place in school. Lots of schools will set in different subjects based on academic achievement, or you're kind of tied to those kind of systems and practices and the timetable, which make it all very challenging.
And yes, the timetable is another constraint, isn't it? We know that there's not enough time to teach our subject, whether or not, whatever the age of our children are. And if you don't have time, then you think, well, it's a luxury if I start, doing something a bit different, because I might need to spend a bit more time on this or that or the other, and I just don't have that.
So, Catherine, I mean, there are lots of challenges, but what are some of the strategies that our educators, given all those constraints, what can they do to mitigate some of these challenges?
So I think teaching excellent lessons is beneficial for all young people, and it's proven that really works for children with special educational needs and disabilities. And just taking a bit of time to think about classroom practice, about giving more time to answer questions, having routine and structure in the classroom, and high expectations and clear expectations of every child who's in there are really, really important. And I think probably one of the best things that we can do is just provide some variety in how the young people can interact with lessons, with content, how we present it. And that, is really, really well illustrated by the Universal Design for Learning. And I know we have another expert that can talk beautifully about this.
Yes, also joining us today is Meg Ray, an experienced high school computer science teacher, special educator, and curriculum developer. Meg teaches computer science education courses at New York University Steinhardt and special education courses at Hunter College. In your view, Meg, what does an inclusive computing classroom look like?
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm going to echo some of what Catherine was saying. When I walk into a computer science classroom, I'll know it's inclusive if I can see every student that's a member of that classroom participating in a meaningful way. So that doesn't mean that they're all doing the same thing. It doesn't even necessarily mean that they're all using the same materials, but they're all interacting. There's not a student sitting off in the corner, doing a CS tutorial by themselves, while the rest of the class, participates in a project like building robots. If a student has specific educational needs, they're still part of a group, doing group work, and the teacher has found different ways for that student to be included and to bring their strengths into that work.
And I think that kind of nicely kind of leads us a little bit into UDL, which Catherine mentioned, the Universal Design for Learning. And I know that this is something that you're particularly interested in and have some experience of, having been involved in a paper called Teaching Elementary Computer Science Through Universal Design for Learning. So do you want to just give us like the 30-second, like, what is UDL? What's that framework, and what does it do for us as educators?
Sure. So UDL is a framework that's based on neuroscience, and it addresses 3 different areas of learning. And it looks at how do we broaden access in our planning from the get-go in these 3 different areas. How can we plan ahead so that what students learn, why they're engaged with it, and how they're learning is more accessible to more students in the class. So this doesn't take away the need for accommodations or modifications for some students. Those things are provided on top of a universal design framework.
And so in the article that we've got, I'm actually referring to an article here in the Big Book of Pedagogy, where one of our writers sort of summarizes your paper. There's sort of 3 different areas they sort of refer to as the multiple means of engagement, of representation, and action and expression. So what do those kind of relate to in the framework?
Sure. So in the framework, there's a framework that is, you can see it at cast.org, cast.org. And it has, we have 3 different principles. And then within those principles, there's more detailed checkpoints that I won't get into, but there is research behind each checkpoint itself. So the 3 principles, the first one, that I think about is representation. So that's, what are we learning? How are you representing new information to students? Then we also think about action and expression. How are students learning in the classroom? How are they expressing their learning? And this includes physical action, but also how they're thinking about it, how they're expressing it in other ways, not just how they're moving in the classroom. And then the last one is about engagement. So that's the why of learning. And for each student, that's different. So these are the ways, how are we hooking students in and engaging them, and how are they relating to that why and their motivation throughout the lesson?
So what does UDL look like when we apply it to the subject of computing or computer science?
Sure. So UDL isn't something that you can just say, oh, I'm doing UDL. Do this thing, you're doing UDL, right? Because it's very much about responding to the students in your course, in your classroom. So really, when we are training teachers on UDL, it's really about a way of moving in the classroom, a way of being, and a way of planning. So thinking about external, what are the barriers to learning? And not thinking about that as internal to the child, but what are the barriers in my classroom, in the curriculum? And thinking about that, and then using the principles, those 3 principles we talked about, as sort of a reference or a guide for how do I overcome those barriers then. So it's a stance, it's a way of moving in the classroom. Okay, I want to point to Maya Israel's work in the Creative Technology Resource Lab at the University of Florida. So she is a colleague and mentor of mine who also worked on that paper, and several others on UDL. And she and I and several other people involved in that project have created a UDL CS kind of crosswalk sheet. So we are gathering different examples. So what does it look like to give different to give multiple means of representation in a CS classroom? And so we have a reference sheet that just has a bunch of CS specific examples, and we're also continuing to collect those examples from teachers as we meet more teachers, as we provide professional development with more teachers. We're expanding that.
Thank you. And I think we kind of touch upon a few of those in the article. So where can and this is to both Catherine and Meg, where can our educators go to find out more about inclusion sort of principles in general, but also specifically UDL framework and how to apply it to their classroom?
I think some of the best places to go at the moment, there's never enough information in terms of this. I'm always keen to push out more. Hello World has been doing a great job of this. So, starting with issue 11, which was a focus on inclusion and diversity, there are tons of really, really good articles in there that people can go and read and find out a little bit more about some of the strategies you can use. I've been writing a regular column since then around the inclusive classroom in Hello World each time with a different sort of focus. I also am doing some work with the Computing at School Working Party Include, which is all about raising the profile of inclusion and diversity and supporting teachers with that. And our website, which I'm sure will be in the show notes at some point, has a few more, our webpage on CAS has a few more places and pointers of where to go. And we're in the middle of a bit of an exercise at the moment of signposting sort of 10 things that you can do to support inclusion, or 10 things you can do to support diversity in the classroom. And that's a really good starting point. But the other thing I'd say to teachers really is actually talk to your students, find out what helps them, works for them, what kind of things, activities do they want to do. They might not want to write something down, they might want to create a comic strip or make an animation, or think about the things that they want to do. And also talk to the special needs department in your school. So your Senkos in this country, I don't know what they're called over in the US, but there will be professionals in school who are supporting young people with special needs and disabilities, and they have a lot of strategies that you can learn from, and just think about, well, what does this look like in computing and computer science? So I think that's my sort of 3 areas to go have a little look at more information.
Yes. Well, first, I'd like to say that I really enjoy the inclusion column in Hello World. So thank you, Catherine. That's a great resource. A couple others. So just for general UDL, the cast.org website and also understood.org has a really nice teacher guide to you that's really aimed at practitioners and teachers. And then as far as CS specific, the Creative Computing Research Lab at the University of Florida, we have several, there's a project called Tactical Briefs. And so there's a brief on UDL specifically, and then also on other things related to inclusion within that. And then also there's a new project, so you can find it on Twitter at UDL for CS. So we were just funded by the NSF to have a national network in the US for gathering UDL resources for K-8 computer science education. So there's not a website yet, but you can follow it on Twitter, and that will be coming out with a lot of very practical materials.
Great. And my question, I think we sort of touched upon some individual kind of strategies. And Catherine, you mentioned your the 10 tips that the Include group are working on. If an educator listening to this podcast was to do one thing differently in their classroom tomorrow to support inclusion, what would that one thing be? Who wants to take on that question first?
So my one thing is not really, it's not a thing it's not a magic strategy you can just go do to make inclusion, because that doesn't exist, unfortunately. But it's this idea, this stance of being curious and widening your aperture. And that's a concept I actually got from Zaretta Hammond's book about culturally responsive teaching in the brain. But I really like to apply it to UDL and think about, how do you get really curious about why are students behaving in different ways? And how can I widen my aperture for why that might be? And think about, with the curiosity, think about what could be a barrier in the classroom or the curriculum? How could I get creative to change how the environment or curriculum is set up to see if I can address this, rather than seeing everything as a behavior or motivation problem, which is something that in education we're really taught to default to.
I think building on that, I'd say, have your high expectations of all your young people. And, your expectations might be different depending on what they are, but they can all, achieve in your classroom. And if you have those high expectations, you can find ways of engaging and including and supporting all your young people to do this really well. But yeah, as Meg said, there's no one really simple thing to do, but go and find out about UDL, go and read the 10 things for inclusion, and they will kind of start pointing you on the way.
Yeah, so building off of that because there isn't one simple thing, that it is a little bit complex to use this framework and think about, it can be very intimidating, especially given our time constraints as teachers, how overburdened we are. So to not let that deter you, to pick one thing, what is one thing you could handle today? And do that thing. Just start somewhere instead of feeling like this is too big to ever do and putting it aside. That's very tempting, but to find one thing that's doable for you and start there and then build on that.
that feels like a really good bit of advice for teaching in general. And I think having that piece of advice at the beginning of my teaching career would have been really helpful rather than trying to fix everything in one go. But I also think, our computing community, there's a lot of educators around the world who have, taken on computing, which is this really big, different sort of, challenge for everybody. And so I think if there's one group of teachers that have got experience of taking on something big and challenging and breaking it down, and I think it's this group of teachers. I think we're in good hands, I think.
We asked you, our audience, for your thoughts on this topic, and we used the question, what do you do in your computing setting to reduce barriers and support all learners?
So the first response that I saw was one from Ben Garside, who was on our previous episode of the podcast, who talked about getting to know your students. And both Catherine and Meg touched upon this as well. Find out their interests, try and discover what the barriers are for them in their learning, and use strategies from your toolkit of pedagogical approaches to get the best out of them.
There's lots of answers here that involve pedagogy. So Rachel Vidler says, try to ensure that the use, modify, create pedagogy is embedded in lessons, be that scaffolded projects on Scratch or templates within media creation, breaking down the process for learners and offering different strategies for them to access the lesson.
So Claire Rawlingson, who's a regular contributor, talks about setting activities that do not necessarily need to be finished, giving learners the time and space to embed their knowledge rather than feeling under pressure to get that task completed. Learners can be and feel successful even with unfinished activities. She also talks about paired programming, another pedagogical strategy, with clearly defined driver navigator roles where learners can support each other in a sort of fairly natural kind of way.
And Katie Vanderpeer Brown says, know your students beyond the core data and differentiate based on that knowledge. Some will need support to move from concrete to the abstract. Model and expose your thinking as the expert to help them, and use tracing to develop a mental model. My thanks to Catherine Elliott and Meg Ray for sharing their expertise with us today. I found it so interesting. I'm so grateful that you gave up your time to talk with us. You can read their articles on this topic in issue 11 and 15 of Hello World magazine, as well as in our big book of computing pedagogy. If you have a question for us or a comment about our discussion today, then you can email via podcast@helloworld.cc, or you can tweet us at helloworld_edu. So, James, what did we learn?
Well, for me, I think the knowing your students, knowing your learners, understanding their needs was, really came across in our conversation today, as well as having high expectations for every single one of the learners that you were presented with. How about you, Carrie-Anne?
Well, I think what I've learned is this is just the starting point. I think this is a good introduction to inclusion and applying kind of first steps and strategies towards having a really inclusive classroom. But I think this is definitely a topic we're going to have to come back to. So this is me booking time with you guys going forward.
We're going to need a sequel then.